What's up YouTube? KS Gun Guy here. Thanks for joining me today as always. So I'm excited to finally circle back around to the Glock 19X. I did a video on this not too long ago and it's somewhere in the video channel library. Be sure to check that out. But it was basically a conversational video about the 19X and some of the hype or lack thereof on its release. But before we start with that, I want to give a quick shout out to a company called Goat Guns. You guys might have seen a couple of these out there on maybe the Gun Collective or some other channels like that, and they sent me a couple of samples to try out, and I gotta say, so far I'm very impressed. I'll be excited to take this to the range and see what it can do. Okay, I'm just kidding. It can't really shoot, but I'll tell you what, this thing is enormous, and I almost feel like it kind of can. So I'm excited to bring that to you guys at a later time. So by now you guys are probably pretty familiar with the 19X, and you probably are aware that it met with a lukewarm reception, let's put it that way, and I think partly because it was something a little different than what people were expecting. Now, Glock did make an entry into the military handgun selection, so to speak, a little over a year ago, and their entrant was very close to the 19X. Of course, it lost out to the SIG P320, but when they brought out the 19X, a lot of people were saying, well, it's not quite exactly like the gun that was in the trials. It doesn't have the thumb safeties or anything like that, so it's not really the same. So from a collection perspective, perhaps it doesn't quite fit in with what people really wanted. So I totally get that, but I have to say, and I said it on my original video, so far I've actually been very impressed. Now, let's go ahead and knock a couple of specs out of the way, then we'll talk about the features and what makes this fairly unique in the Glock lineup. So the overall length is 7.44 inches. The height is 5.47 inches. Now it's about 5.8 inches roughly with the extended magazine. More on that here in just a moment. The barrel length is 4.02 inches. Now it does have the marksman barrel with the enhanced polygonal rifling and better crown. Just for those of you who are wondering, it's very similar to the Gen 5 Glocks out there. Now the width on this is 1.3 inches, so it is a little bit wider than your standard Glock, partly because of its ambidextrous controls. Again, more on that here in just a moment as well. And the weight unloaded is 24.83 ounces and loaded 31.39 ounces. Now, in terms of those magazines, as I mentioned before, it does come with two 17-round magazines with the +2 extension, this guy right here. It's all this coyote coloring that matches the gun, which is nice, but then it also does come with a flat base plate magazine. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like right there. Makes it a little bit more normal looking, so to speak. Now, one thing I said in my original video, and it was not really my quote necessarily, but a lot of people were saying that the 19X kind of looks a little bit like a mullet, business in front and party in the rear. I kind of get that to a degree, but people usually say that more capacity is a better thing, and this having 19 rounds plus one in the pipe is pretty darn cool for sure. Now it also, and I'm going to get those guys out of the way here, will take your older magazines, and actually I like the look of this a little bit better. It breaks up that coyote finish and it just kind of adds a little bit more black to it. So I'm going to stick with this for the time being. Now the slide finish on the Glock 19X is the NPVD coating, so it's similar to the Gen 5 that came out. However, one thing that I've noticed is just a little bit different is that it's got a little bit more matte to it. Now you're not going to be able to really see the texture altogether too well with this. However, I assure you it's less slick than the Gen 5s. It was about one of the few criticisms I really had of the Gen 5. I like the darker slide on the Gen 5, but it is pretty darn slick, so if your hands are wet or bloody or anything like that, you might have a little bit more trouble manipulating the slide. So again, I mean, just even seeing that right there, there's enough bite, enough texture. It almost reminds me of maybe a Gen 4 Glock, and I much prefer that texture right there. So of course the frame is polymer as you would expect, and it is a striker fired firearm. Again, it is basically the same operation, same everything that you would come to expect with any of your Glocks out there. Now in terms of safety, again, it doesn't have that thumb safety like the military entrant did, but it does have the trigger safety or trigger lever bar, whatever you want to call it right there. So it does have a sort of external safety, and then of course additional safeties on the inside. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the features of the 19X. We'll start with the grip, of course, and it does carry forward the Gen 4 grip texture right here. And I've often said I really like the Gen 4 grip texture. I mean, I think it does a great job. It certainly stays planted in your hand. You get a nice purchase on it. It does come with 4 back straps, just like the Gen 4s do, so you can certainly have a little bit of modularity there. And there's your front strap. Now, you'll notice there are no finger grooves, just like on the Gen 5. Now, the 19X being sort of a hybrid of being a 19 slide and a 17 frame is a little bit different. Now, I've always said that I much prefer the 19s. They sit a little bit better in the hand for me, even with finger grooves like a Gen 4 or Gen 3, whatever it is. They just sit better. Those grooves are spaced just right for the size of my hand, whereas the 17 never sat quite as well, but with those finger grooves being gone, this works really well. So I get the exact grip that I want on the gun, and it sits nice. I'm not fighting any sort of grooves or anything like that. I know I'm probably making more of a fuss over it than I need to, but for those who want the grooves gone, they've done it and they've kept it with the 19X. Now, another thing that's a little bit different about the 19X, if you guys remember with the Gen 5, they did a flared magwell. Well, they haven't done that with the 19X. It's not really flared. Now, on the inside, it is flared just a little bit, so it makes magazine insertion just a little bit easier, which is great. But that's pretty standard for most Glocks, but they did not bring out or taper outward the bottom of the magwell at all. So, I think that's fine. The Gen 5 magwell was pretty cool. I enjoyed that, but one thing that was really weird about the Gen 5, it had a little cutout right here in the front of the frame, and that was to clear any malfunctions, but you had to do it from the front. And most people, when they clear malfunctions, they want to go from the side. Now, I sort of wish that the 19X would have a little, just slight indentions maybe right here at the very end, to help make any malfunction clearing a little bit easier. They decided not to do it. You can still grab your flat base magazine and it'll still work. You just have to work a little harder at it. It's not that big of a deal, but I would have liked to have seen that. Now, one thing that's a little bit unusual, they did include this little lip right here in front, and I'll tell you, it's kind of strange, and it makes for some aftermarket magazines to not work properly with the 19X. So it's kind of an odd deal right there. I sort of wish they just left that off, but some people have also said it gives them just a little bit more grip room, which is great. So it extends that grip just a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think for most people, they probably could have done without that, including me. Now, you'll notice it also does have a lanyard on it, probably to be a little bit reminiscent again of that military entrant right there. You can easily pop this out if you don't like it. Doesn't bother me one way or the other. It's a little bit campy, but again, not that big of a deal, and doesn't prohibit any sort of shooting or anything like that. Now, in terms of the undercut right here, one thing I've noticed, and I could be wrong on this, but I feel like it's not as good or not as prevalent as the Gen 5s. The Gen 5s seem to be up just a tiny bit higher, and I could be totally losing my mind here. Now, thankfully, without the finger grooves, it's not that big of a deal, so I don't suffer from any sort of Glock knuckle or anything like that, although I'll be honest with you, I never really have. But I know a lot of people do. So hopefully with the lack of finger grooves and at least a little bit of an undercut there, it shouldn't be too big of an issue. And then everything else on the frame in terms of its ergonomics are basically the same that you would have come to expect with any other Glock out there. Now, that does have a little bit of texture right there on the trigger guard in the front, so if you use this as some sort of a reference point or anything like that, I don't, but some people do. It's fine, it's there. I always thought it'd be pretty cool if Glock put a little bit of texture right here like some other companies are doing now. That would be a nice enhancement, a little bit of a reference point on both sides, but again, I'm being a little bit nitpicky. Now, it does have an accessory rail, of course, for your lights, lasers, grenade launchers, whatever you want to throw on there, as you would expect from any weapon that basically could be go to war, so to speak. Now, in terms of magazine release, it is not ambidextrous out of the box, although you can swap it out like pretty much any Glock out there these days, and it's quite easy to do. One little bar on the inside, you just have to pop it out, swap it around, and put the bar back in. Not too big of a deal. And again, your slide lock, slide release is ambidextrous, and they have made it just a little bit wider than in previous versions. I actually really like that, because I use a slide release, especially if I'm running a can on this. More on that in just a little while. So it's ambidextrous, not quite out of the box fully, but it is pretty darn close, and I think a lot of people are really excited to see that with Glocks. Now, in terms of the slide, it's pretty standard fare for Glock. You do have your rear serrations right here. Now, I said this before on the Gen 5, and I'll say it again on the 19X. I really wish they'd carry forward those forward serrations that they did on the Glock 19 Gen 4 FS, or forward serration model that came out last year very briefly. I guess it was a summer model or something like that. They have the tooling. I just wish they had done it. I know a lot of people don't care about that sort of thing. At the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal, but if you're going to do it once, you might as well do it again, because some people definitely do use those. Now, one other thing that is really cool about the Glock 19X, the sights on this, believe it or not, these are not your standard polymer U-notch sights. These are actually metal night sights, which is great. Now, they are Glock night sights. I'll give you a better look at these right here. They're not anti-glare or anything like that, but they actually work really well. They definitely do. It would be nice if it had a high def front. It does not. However, they glow very brightly. They definitely do the job, and I love the fact that there are steel sights on this. Now, I know there are some people that say the polymer sights work just fine. There's no reason to switch them out. I always do. I always switch out Glock sights. I want to make sure that I'm running some sort of steel sight, whether it's night sights or just steel or maybe fiber optic, because the chances of them breaking are far less than the polymer. So that's just my opinion on that, but I do like that they put these sights on there. Now, in terms of shooting, this Glock is basically everything you would come to expect from any Glock out there. It's got all the same shooting characteristics. Now, I've been recovering from an injury on my left arm, so I haven't been able to shoot very much, but I was able to actually get out and do a little bit of shooting, believe it or not, earlier today, and both with and without a can, so I'm excited to share a little bit of that experience with you. And even though my left hand is not doing quite what I wanted to do in terms of grip right now because of the injury, the Glock was incredibly accurate. It did everything it needed to do, and as long as I was paying attention, with the occasional flyer, of course, it definitely performed very well. And I attribute that to a couple things, and more on the can story here in just a little while. But I attribute the shootability to this to, again, a couple of things. The ergonomics, those lack of finger grooves, at least for this shooter right here, is very important. But then also the trigger. Now, this also has the Gen 5 trigger on it, and you're probably wondering, well, I'll do that one more time, probably wondering about that Gen 5 trigger and what that actually means. So I will show you if I can get this darn thing apart. I'm going to show you this guy right here. Now, this safety plunger right here, or firing pin block, is actually the same as the Glock 42 or the Glock 43. So it's not the rounded ball that we're used to, or sort of rounded ball that comes with Glocks, but instead it's got this ramp right here. And I think this really allows for a cleaner shooting experience. So when I got this particular Glock 19X, I was actually really impressed at the trigger pull. Now, again, it's this standard Glock trigger right here. I do have an Apex trigger on the way for it. I'll showcase that at a later time. But out of the box, this actually is done pretty well. Now, one thing I don't like about any Glock triggers, now if you use the pad of your fingers, and I don't, I actually put my finger all the way through because I've got pretty long fingers. But with your pad of your finger against the face of the trigger, you can feel that safety lever, and that drives me a little bit nuts. I like something to be a little bit more flat than this is. That said, it's not altogether that bad. Now, in terms of its take-up, we've got just a little bit of take-up right there. It's smooth. It's a little bit heavy, but it's smooth. And then you get to a nice defined wall, and there's your break. And I have to say, the break on this really isn't bad. And it's coming in around 5 3/4 pounds on the Lyman gauge, which actually out of the box for a Glock is really good. And I haven't done any sort of 25-cent trigger job or anything on this yet. I definitely will. And there's your receipt, or your reset right there, or receipt if you're from another country, apparently. But again, we'll do our trigger. There's our take up right there, and we get to our wall. There's our break. And then our reset, and we're back out to the start again. So from a trigger standpoint, this actually is pretty darn good out of the box. There have been some Glocks that really have been just lousy out of the box, at least ones that I've had, that I've experienced, and I've had to do a lot of work to get them to a place where I really enjoy them and enjoy shooting. But this I was able to grab and really run, so I'm excited to see what the Apex trigger can do at a later time. So more on that here in just a little while. Now, I told you guys I was going to tell you about my suppressor experience with this. Now, I was running this with a Silencer Co. threaded barrel, and it's a new barrel. In fact, it was its maiden voyage to go out and shoot with the Glock 19X. I was really excited to give that a try, and it was odd. It shot every time. That wasn't too big of an issue. However, the gun would not completely cycle. And in other words, it would go to right about there, right about there. Every single time, almost every single time. I mean, I think it worked a couple of times, but what I would have to do is while I was shooting was basically use my support thumb kind of like this and pop it back. So I'm showing you a little bit of that footage right now. So it has nothing to do with the gun. It's not the functionality of the gun whatsoever. It actually has to do with the suppressor, the weight of the suppressor, the pressures that are going on in there, and also the fact that the back top of the barrel, the Silencer Co. barrel, needs to be worked in just a little bit. And I talked to the gunsmith at Centerfire Shooting Sports, my home away from home, and he's an exceptional gunsmith. And he offered to do a little bit of tapering on it, but you know, I'm just going to go ahead and naturally shoot it and let it work its way in. Not too big of an issue whatsoever. So I'm excited once that gets running, because I'll tell you what, every shot that I put down range was extremely accurate, more accurate than without the suppressor. I find the suppressors to be a nice little cheat right there, so you'll be seeing a lot more of those, I promise you that. But again, in terms of the shooting ability or the shootability of the Glock 19X, it definitely did a very good job. So what do I think of the Glock 19X overall? Well, I have to say, and I've always said this, I'm a fan of Glock. I enjoy Glocks for what they are, and for a long time, that's basically all I own. Certainly not the case now, but I still enjoy them. They feel good to me, and I seem to shoot them on most days reasonably well, and so it does just fine. And the fact that this is sort of a hybrid between a 19 and a 17 makes it a very intriguing proposition for me. So I've had a really good time with it, and I like the features that it offers. Now, I understand that it looks a little bit gangly to some, and to some perhaps it's not as carryable as some other firearms because of the longer grip. I understand that. But there are also a lot of other people that have been carrying much larger firearms for years and years without too much of a problem. So it all comes down to the individual shooter. So for me, I really like the 19X. I think it's really cool, and I'm looking forward to doing some more videos with it. So speaking of looking forward to, I'm looking forward to your comments down below. So be sure to sound off and let me know about your experiences with the 19X or any questions you have for me. I'm always looking forward to those comments. Once again, thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.